prison. And in fact, much of the prison population in the UK was people going in and out of prison for begging or for sleeping rough.
That's tragic.
Yeah, well, it was tragic, but the point was, what it's replaced it for is something even more tragic, and that is that you've got people who have a right to sleep in the streets. Not they have a right; it's just the police totally ignore it. So they and the magistrates and the social workers just totally ignore it. So you've got the opposite now. What you've got is you've got the tragedy of people sleeping in the streets and not being arrested. But the tragedy is they don't then move them on. If at best what they do is they warehouse them off the streets. So now we have an even larger group of people who are stuck. 50 years ago, when I was pretending I was older than I was and sleeping in hostels, I would have to pay for that hostel, so I would have to work for that hostel. And what you had was 95% of the occupants would be people who had a job to pay for the hostel and to pay for their food because they couldn't beg and they couldn't sleep in the streets. Now you have this vast industry of hostels where they are paid for by taxpayers' money, and what they do is they just sit around and do nothing. And I swear on my life, if you see these people, they age quicker because they've got no reason to get up in the morning, and they've got no purpose in life. And if they get drunk or they have drug problems, it's money that they've got from the state or they've got from begging off people. Nobody has to work. I mean, when I people say to me, why did I start the big issue with amongst people who are heavy drinkers and heavy drug users? I said, well, look, I want to do what most drinkers and drug users do. The most drinkers and drug users, if they want to have some drink or some drugs, they ring up a dealer or they go to the shop and they buy the stuff. The unfortunate tragedy is of homeless people, very, very poor people who have to do that, is they've got to rob somebody or beg it off somebody. So therefore they've got to humiliate themselves and probably hurt other people in order to feed their habits. And that's why our prisons are full of tragic people, not just homeless people, who have to hurt somebody or even kill somebody in order to feed their vice. And I think if the big issue does nothing else, it stops people having to do terrible things in order to feed the habits. The big drinkers and the big drug users are not the homeless or the poor. It's the people in jobs and the people in work. They can do it, because they can afford it. So I've always wanted to address that in anomaly first of all before you go anywhere else.
In terms of the business model, how does the paper work?
The way it works in the UK, and it works differently in South Africa, in Taiwan, and in places like Korea, that we've started in since Japan, South America. Where the way it works is that we meet people who are crestfallen, broken. Mostly, I mean, some of them are not, because some of them, don't get defeated. But we do deal with a lot of really troubled people. And what they're looking for is they're looking for some money, and they're looking for money that doesn't involve them getting harassed, and it is done with dignity. When I started the big issue, one of the big reasons I started was because people did say to me, anything is better than begging. And so what happens to they come to us, we give them free papers, we train them up, we look after them, we get coffee for them, we try and get them placed if they're sleeping rough. We don't always get them into the hostel system, because the problem is that hostel systems are pretty hostile places. But we try and get them housed or try and get them into a kind of community or something like that. But the thing is that what we do is we support them so that they can then start earning their own money and start standing on their own 2 feet. And that nearly always leads to an incredible transformation.
I was going to say that one of the things that being homeless does is that you never know when you're going to eat again. People look at you differently. They treat you differently. And the fact that you're marginalized to that level, a lot of people don't want to give you a job, even if you were qualified to do it. So it's like a catch-22.
It is a catch-22 situation. It's much, much different in the UK in some ways. When I worked in the States and had dealings with American homelessness, I think you have a much, much more institutionalized homelessness. I think ours is always a kind of reflections of sudden economic reversals. You have this kind of you have this kind of shifting population, between which I noticed when I was in California, people who are restless, who move on because of because there's very little social support for them. In the UK, we have a very large social support for people in need and people in poverty. It doesn't always work very well, and it's very crude, and people still fall out onto the streets. But here, we have a very strange situation where people on the streets are supported as beggars. I mean, you can make a sizable amount of money. You could make more than a working man begging in parts of the UK, but they won't give you work, and that's the big tragedy. So people will support you in the streets, but they won't give you work. And what I've seen in the States is something even worse than that, which is you can't get the work, and you can't panhandle because it's illegal, and also a lot of people tend to turn against panhandlers, against beggars. So you got a difference in North America and in Europe.
In the United States, I know at least 5 people who've lost their homes, whose finances have dried up, and several people who are literally going from place to place, sleeping on people's couches, etc. This is expanding here in the United States. And I keep trying to tell them, this is not your fault. And the fact that they can't get hired in enough time to create the supply, to then move into their own place with first and last and security, and then their credit goes bad. It ends up being like a vicious cycle here. I don't know if you have a credit rating, for example, in the UK, in order to get a job or to get an apartment if they look at your credit. But here, you can be 3 months out of work, your credit goes bad, you lose your place, and you're done. You're done here.
I noticed that when I was in the States, and obviously when I was working there quite regularly, it was what's that? Well, you're a couple of checks away from the streets. We haven't faced that as much as you. I mean, if you see that Mike Moore film about those people who are repossessed, that's pretty difficult to imagine coping in the UK, happening in the UK, because there's more coping mechanisms. But it's coming our way, because what we now have is the biggest economic reversal of fortune since the 30s. We've got these big cuts in the economy, which are going to take place early next year. And over the next 3-4 years, we're going to have to be repaying an enormous amount of money. And what we've also had, which I think you've had as well, you've had this vastly increased activity within the economy and the growth of enormous amounts of jobs. Well, a lot of the new jobs that are disappearing in the UK were built on that kind of risk-laden banker's paradise, the expansion of credit and all that stuff. And a lot of these jobs have been conjured out of the air. A lot of the social support that has been conjured out of the air from this bankers-led, risk-taking, subprime, whatever you like to call it. And that's disappearing. So we are going to start getting an American phenomenon, which you've had of people having absolutely nothing to fall back on. We have a situation over here where the local authority has a statutory duty to rehouse people who have fallen into homelessness. So if you get your place if you